In video editing, due to the hierarchical nature of the track structure, most types of media event will block out any event on a track below it. There are media event types that don't follow this rule. Text events, for example, have a transparent background which allows the lower event to show through. Masking is a means by which parts of a media event can be made transparent, and a mask is a two-dimensional shape used for that purpose. The mask is drawn onto the media event using a variety of tools, allowing custom shapes to be created. In this episode, I'm going to take a detailed look at masks and the tools available to create them. I'll also describe how masks can be transformed and edited. I'll make a start by creating a composite shot containing a yellow plane layer. Before proceeding, I want to briefly describe the tools available for creating masks. There are two masking tools in the Layer Panel toolbar, and these also appear in the Viewer Panel toolbar. The first tool gives access to 5 predefined mask shapes, with the currently selected shape showing as an icon. Access to the shape selection is by clicking and holding on the tool, which reveals 5 shape options. Selecting one replaces the icon and switches mode to the selected one. The second tool allows you to draw masks freehand. There's a second mode for this tool, which is obtained by a long press. I'll deal with both these modes later on, and I'll describe the difference between them. Now to create a few masks. But before I do, I have to inform you of a serious bug in this version of the software, version 2022.4. and the previous version, 2022.3. If you attempt to draw more than one mask in the layer panel, the software will close without warning. If you need to draw multiple masks, and no doubt you will need to at some time, make sure that you draw them using the Viewer panel. I've informed FX Home about this, and they've reproduced the bug in-house. They've informed me that they will try and fix it in the next build. Having said that, I'll switch to the Viewer panel before creating the first mask with the Rectangle Mask tool. You can see that the rectangle remains yellow, whilst everything outside of it is converted into transparency, indicated by the checkered pattern. Any media event on the track underneath the yellow plane would now show through where the transparency is. I can demonstrate this by adding a new plane layer of a different colour. To view the result, I have to place the green layer underneath the yellow layer. At this stage, it's worth pointing out the three controls in the mask entry header. The coloured square determines the colour of the mask perimeter. Clicking on this brings up a colour swatch so that you can change it. The square with the circle inside is the invert mask control. By default, as shown earlier, everything outside the mask is made transparent. If this control is toggled, the inside of the mask will be transparent and everything outside will be opaque. You can see that in this scenario, the yellow and green areas change places. The control icon changes to reflect the current mode. Masks in these two modes are sometimes called positive and negative masks. The drop-down list next to the invert mask control contains a list of mask blending options, which I don't intend to deal with in this episode. For normal purposes, this should be left at default, which is Add. I'll now draw a rounded rectangle. The dialog that opens enables you to customize the corner radius. The next in the list is the ellipse. Next comes the polygon. This allows you to draw a multi-sided mask. The default shape is a pentagon, but a dialog box appears that allows you to modify the shape. The points option is fairly self-explanatory. The roundness option isn't so self-explanatory. At 0%, the points are positive and pointed. If the control is increased positively, the points become rounded. Going beyond 200% produces some interesting results. If the control is increased negatively, you get similar results. Be careful with this though. I've had Hitfilm crash on me while playing with this control. You can reset each parameter by right-clicking on either the slider control or the value field and selecting Reset. Last in the list is the star. The default shape is a 5-pointed star, but aspects of the star can be changed with the controls in the dialog that opens. Again, the points control is fairly obvious. The inner and outer roundness controls determine the roundness of the inner points and the outer points respectively. Increasing these controls negatively will produce some interesting results. The ratio control determines the ratio of the inner points to the outer points. Many interesting shapes can be created using different value combinations of these controls. Now for the freehand tool. As I mentioned earlier, there are two available modes for this tool: freehand mask and freehand path. Both modes allow you to draw masks freehand. Freehand masks can be drawn using one of two methods. If you click several times in the Layer or Viewer panel, each click creates a control point that's connected to the previous control point by a straight line, called a segment. In the freehand mask mode, the mask is closed by either clicking on the first control point created or right-clicking any of the control points and selecting Close from the context menu. The second method is used to create a mask with curved segments instead of straight segments. To create a curved segment, click and drag the mouse. Keep clicking and dragging to create the desired mask shape. Close the mask in the same way. I'll deal with the way a mask shape is changed later on. The second mode, freehand path, is accessed by a long mouse press on the freehand tool. I'll talk a bit more about this mode later on. Before moving on to mask transforming and editing, it's worth mentioning keyboard modifiers. These are specific keys or a combination of specific keys that enable masks to be drawn or edited in a variety of ways. For instance, by default, the rectangle tool will draw a rectangle with the side lengths determined by how the mask is drawn. Using the appropriate keyboard modifier while the rectangle is being drawn will draw a perfect square, irrespective of how the rectangle is drawn. Keyboard modifiers affect masks in three different scenarios: mask drawing, mask transforming, and mask editing. I'll mention how keyboard modifiers affect how masks are transformed or edited a little later. Meanwhile, as I've already dealt with mask drawing in the last section, I'll mention here how these modifiers affect the drawing of masks. If the rectangle or rounded rectangle tool is enabled, holding the Shift key down while dragging the mouse will draw a perfect square or a perfect rounded cornered square. If the Alt key is held down, a rectangle or rounded rectangle will be drawn extending from its centre. If the Alt and Shift keys are held down, a square or rounded square will be drawn extending from its centre. If the Ellipse tool is enabled, a perfect circle will be drawn. If either the Polygon or Star tool is enabled, they will be drawn in a static position. I'll show you what I mean by that. If I draw the polygon without holding Shift down, it's drawn from one point and can be rotated while drawing. If I draw with Shift held down, the polygon can't be rotated. In general terms, transforming a mask means changing its scale, position or rotation, amongst other parameters. To perform this kind of transforming, the Selection tool must be selected in either the Viewer or Layer panels. To select a mask for transforming, make sure that it's selected under the Masks section of the layer. When a mask is selected in this way, it will be contained within a dotted rectangular bounding box. The periphery of this box will have 8 control points. With the green layer showing, it's a little difficult to see these, so I'll hide the green layer. If you hover the mouse over any of the control points, a handy label pops up which details the use of the modifiers. By default, with no modifier held down, clicking on any of the corner points and moving the mouse will scale the mask uniformly about its centre. If any of the side points are moved, the mask will be sized horizontally or vertically, depending on which control point is moved. With the Shift key held down, dragging a corner point scales the mask non-uniformly about its centre. The Shift modifier has no effect when dragging any side control point. Holding the Control key down while dragging any control point will scale the mask uniformly about the opposite control point. Holding the Control and Shift keys down will scale the mask non-uniformly about the opposite control point. The final modifier is the Alt key. Holding this down while dragging a corner point will rotate the mask about its centre. Transforming a mask can also be carried out by adjusting the parameters in the Transform section for the mask. Let's now look at how a freeform mask is transformed. With the Selection tool selected, the freeform mask behaves like any of the predefined masks. It has a bounding box with 8 control points and can be transformed using the methods I've just described. The difference between mask transforming and mask editing can be a bit vague. For instance, as I'll show shortly, a certain editing operation can be classed as mask transforming. However, generally speaking, editing a mask means moving, removing, or adding one or more control points. To edit a particular mask, it has to be selected in the Masks section of the Layer entry. It's also necessary to have the Freehand Mask tool selected in either of its two modes. You can now see that the bounding box has been replaced by control points at each point on the star. There are a number of ways to edit the mask. I'll go through these one at a time. Any particular control point can be selected and moved. Once selected, a control point will be coloured blue. One or more control points can be selected and moved. Selecting the points can be achieved in one of two ways. They can be selected by shift clicking or control clicking each one. This encloses the selected points in a bounding box. Note that points within the bounding box but not selected will not be blue and won't be affected by movement of the selected ones. To deselect any control point, simply hover over the point, then Control-click. The second way is to lasso the required control points by dragging over them with the mouse. With this method, you don't have as much control over which points are selected. Because the selected points are enclosed in a bounding box, the area under the points will behave like a separate mask attached to the remainder. Let me demonstrate. With these points selected, I can move any of the bounding box control points to manipulate the selected points. Keyboard modifiers can also be used. Their function is identical to that I described earlier. To add a control point, hover the mouse over a segment and left-click. Segments are the parts of the mask between points. To delete a control point, select it, then press the Delete key. Finally, I want to talk briefly about the freehand tool. I mentioned earlier that this tool has two modes, the freehand mask mode and the freehand path mode. It's not immediately obvious what advantage there is in having two modes, as you can use both to draw freehand masks. The functionality differs when you want to close the mask. With the freehand mask mode, the mask is closed by clicking on the first control point created. An alternative way is to right-click on any control point and select Close from the context menu. To close a mask, it must have at least 3 control points. With the freehand path mode, the mask can only be closed by selecting Close from the context menu. Although you can create masks using the freehand path mode, its primary function is to create an open path that can have effects applied to it. You can also use the Closed option in the context menu to open a closed mask. The mask is made to be opened by one of the path segments being deleted. I think that's about enough for this part. In the next part, I'll be exploring masking further. For instance, I'll be looking at enhancing mask shapes by applying Bezier curves to control points. I'll also demonstrate how to color grade part of an image using a freehand mask. Join me if you can for that one. In the meantime, please consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. Bye for now.